They said that part of the forest doesn't show up on any map, and after what happened to my uncle and his family that night, I understand why. My Uncle David is 52 years old. He spent most of his adult life as a park ranger in Oregon, so he's not someone who scares easily. He knows the forests the way most people know their own backyards. Every trail, every sound, every shift in the wind. That's what makes what he told me so hard to shake. Because if a man like David says something was out there, you believe him. It happened about a year ago. He'd been planning a weekend camping trip with his wife Carol and their 8-year-old son Eli for months. The destination was a remote stretch of wilderness in the Cascade Mountains, a place locals simply called the Hollow. David had driven past it dozens of times during his ranger shifts, but had never camped there. It sat at least 4 hours deep into the backcountry, far from any campground, any cell signal, any other human being. It was exactly the kind of place David loved. He loaded the truck, a big Ford F-250 he'd owned for years, packed the camping gear, the cooler, Eli's backpack, and headed out on a Friday afternoon. Carol sat in the passenger seat, and Eli sat in the back, already asleep before they hit the highway. The drive was peaceful at first, the kind of drive that makes you feel like the world is big and beautiful and yours to explore. They stopped at a roadside diner somewhere around mile marker 190, ate burgers and pie, laughed about nothing in particular. By the time they reached the trailhead that led into the hollow, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. They made camp just as the last light was leaving the sky. David had done this so many times that setting up the tent was almost automatic. Stakes, poles, rain fly, done. Carol arranged the sleeping bags while Eli ran around collecting interesting rocks. They ate sandwiches from the cooler, drank hot coffee from a thermos David had filled before leaving home, and watched the stars come out one by one. David described the hollow at night as one of the most beautiful places he had ever seen. They turned in around 10 o'clock. Carol and Eli were asleep within minutes. David lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the forest settle. That was when he heard it. At first he thought it was an animal, a low rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but too slow, too deliberate. He sat up quietly so as not to wake the others. He listened. The sound was coming from outside the tent, somewhere in the trees to the north. He told himself it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon. He lay back down, but the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got closer. Then, beneath that rhythmic breathing, he heard something else, a faint whistling, not the wind through branches. This was intentional, melodic almost, the way someone might whistle absent-mindedly while they walk, except it was 3 in the morning, and they were completely alone. David reached for his flashlight and unzipped the tent flap. He stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was black in every direction. He swept the flashlight beam in a slow arc. Pine trunks, fern beds, darkness, more darkness, nothing. He stood still for a long moment, listening. The whistling had stopped the exact moment he stepped outside. He went back in. He lay down. 10 minutes passed. Then the whistling started again. This time it was closer, much closer, and now there were footsteps to go with it. Slow, uneven, dragging through the leaf litter like someone walking with tremendous effort or tremendous patience. David grabbed the flashlight again, and this time he walked further from the tent, deeper into the trees, trying to find the source. Every time he moved toward the sound, it shifted, moving 10 yards to his left, then 20 yards behind him, then somewhere above, as though it was in the branches themselves. He couldn't pin it down. He couldn't find it. He was standing about 50 yards from the tent when he realized something. He had walked 50 yards into a dark forest at 3 in the morning, chasing a sound he couldn't identify, and he had left his wife and son alone. He turned around and walked back quickly. When he got back to the tent, everything looked undisturbed. Carol and Eli were still asleep. He zipped the tent shut and sat with his back against the tent pole, flashlight in his lap, listening. The whistling had stopped again. Then maybe 20 minutes later, Carol screamed. David spun around. Carol was sitting up, pressed against the far wall of the tent, her hand gripping Eli's arm. She was shaking. David grabbed her and asked what happened. She said she had felt something grab her ankle through the tent fabric. She had felt fingers, she was certain of it, fingers wrapping around her ankle and pulling her toward the tent door. She had kicked and pulled herself free, and whatever it was had let go. David shone the flashlight around the interior of the tent. Nothing. He checked the exterior with a long, careful sweep. Nothing, but the leaf litter around the base of the tent was disturbed, scraped, as though something had crouched there. He didn't tell Carol about the whistling. He didn't want to make things worse. He told her it was probably an animal, maybe a coyote that had gotten curious furious that he'd scared it off. Eli was awake now, clinging to his mother. His eyes were wide and dry, too frightened even to cry. David pulled both of them close and said, quietly but firmly, that they would wait until first light and then they would leave. That was all, just wait it out. But the forest had other plans. Around 4 in the morning, the air inside the tent felt different, heavier, like pressure building before a thunderstorm. And then, from directly outside the tent door, a voice spoke. Not a growl, not a cry. A voice, low, hollow, resonant, the way a sound echoes in a cave. You shouldn't have come here, it said. David felt every muscle in his body turn to ice. He pulled the sleeping bag around Eli and held Carol's hand tightly. He said nothing. A long moment passed. This land belongs to us, the voice continued. You are trespassing. You have been warned twice already. There will not be a third warning. David is not a man who prays often. He told me that himself. But in that moment, he said every prayer he had ever been taught from his childhood, one after the other, quietly moving his lips in the dark. Carol spoke then, and David said it was the bravest thing he had ever seen. She spoke toward the tent wall in a calm, steady voice. She said they meant no harm. She said they were just a family, that they were exhausted, and their son was frightened, and that if they had unknowingly entered a place they were not supposed to be, she was truly sorry. She asked for one night. She promised they would be gone before sunrise. Silence. A long, terrible silence. Then the voice came back colder than before. Dawn, it said. Not 1 minute after. Then nothing. The pressure in the air lifted. The forest went still. They sat like that, the three of them pressed together, until the sky through the tent fabric began to shift from black to the faintest deep blue. David didn't sleep. Carol didn't sleep. Eli eventually drifted off against his mother's shoulder out of pure exhaustion. When the light was just enough to see by, David packed the tent in 7 minutes, the fastest he had ever done it in his life. He carried Eli on his back and held Carol's hand, and they walked the trail back to the truck without a flashlight, using the pale gray morning to see by. He didn't want to draw attention. He didn't want to announce their movement. As they reached the edge of the tree line, David looked back. He said he couldn't explain what he saw. There were shapes in the trees, not quite solid, not quite shadow, standing between the pines and watching them go. A dozen, maybe more. Their eyes, if you could call them eyes, caught the first light of morning and reflected it back red. David didn't stop. He got his family in the truck. He locked the doors. He drove. They were 40 miles down the highway before anyone spoke. Eli said quietly from the back seat, Dad, they were watching us the whole time, weren't they? It wasn't a question. David saw a doctor the following week. Eli ran a fever for 4 days. Carol didn't sleep properly for 2 weeks. When David went back to work, he mentioned the hollow to an old colleague, a man who had been ranging that area for 30 years. The colleague put down his coffee and looked at David for a long moment. Nobody camps in the hollow, he said. Everybody in the service knows that. I thought you knew that. David asked why. Because, the man said, whatever lives in there doesn't like company. David never went back. He told me this story the way people tell stories that they've carried too long and need to set down somewhere. I wrote down every word. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't know what spoke to them, what grabbed Carol's ankle, what watched them from the trees. But I do know this. David sleeps with the light on now, and he doesn't go camping anymore.